Winter is coming, and I don't just mean Game of Thrones. The Overwatch Winter Wonderland event is right around the corner. The first skin teaser has come out as well. A positively fursome snowboarder skin for Zarya. This is fairly casual wear, other than, I would say, a rather out-of-character, cute Siberian bear hat that she's donning. I never took Zarya for someone who would wear this cutesy kind of stuff, but hey, I'm not gonna dare criticize her, would you? And then, of course, yesterday, Play Overwatch also announced the date for Winter Wonderland coming out, being December 11th, going through the month to January 2nd. And of course, in the background as well is the festive Blizzard Worlds map, which already was a colorful and fun map to play, but now will be set into nighttime with all of the holiday cheer, which is actually one of my favorite parts about these events. Whenever the maps change, it actually does make you feel like you're playing inside that event, which is important because we can expect no new game modes to be coming out with this update. But what I fully do expect to finally come is the big PTR patch that I half expected to come out yesterday, but it didn't. And with that much of a delay, I can almost positively say that it will come out with the event itself next Tuesday. Now, for the rest of the video, I want to discuss more deeply whether this big patch is a gift from Papa Jeff Kaplan or a lump of coal in our stocking. I think a lot of us would like to see a meta shakeup, and it's not so clear if that's the case or not. We've reported on these changes a few times, but just for a quick refresher, if you don't remember, buffs coming to McCree, Bastion, and Torbjorn's Molten Core, and then nerfs coming to Doomfist in a few different areas. Top-level players seem to think that this will kill the character. I'm not so convinced, but it does make sense at the highest level of play. They already could play around beating Doomfist most of the time anyway, but the most controversial of all of the changes is the nerfs, quote-unquote, to Brigitta, where this set of nerfs isn't really disputed, reducing the shield bash damage from 50 to 5 will obviously stop her from one-shotting a ton of characters, including Tracer, and this healing buff, quote-unquote, I believe I've explained before, but quickly, this doesn't really buff her healing. It increases the healing rate from 16 a second to 16.666 repeating 7 a second, which you're not going to notice, and the only time that any of these numbers will matter is in cases where you weren't continuously brawling long enough to reset Inspire, which you almost always did anyway, so those two changes put off to the side. The very controversial one, however, is that now Brigitte can no longer stun through barriers, and a lot of main tank players looked at this and rejoiced, saying, yes, now finally, I don't get bullied as Reinhardt, I can outplay the stun. But the hidden catch-22 with this is that this also goes for Brigitte in the mirror matchup. Brigitte does whatever she wants and runs right at you, and one of the few things that you can do to try to stop these tanky deathball compositions from just running you over is running your own Brigitte. And what this shield bash interaction change does is a lot of the time take away some of the actual impactful and let's say skillful sets of plays in the GOAT's mirror matchup. So that is to say, right now, we're actually seeing a rather entertaining version of GOATs at the highest level of play, where there's a lot of action, actually. Both teams are brawling it out, but there's tons of cooldown management, and the aggressive team usually wins. Whereas with this new change, it's way easier to play defensively with the GOATs comp, which I don't know if that's exactly what we wanted out of any of these nerfs. I've kind of explained it here, but I'm going to go ahead and play out a clip from a podcast called Ultimate Advantage. It's hosted by Dogman, who's a Contenders level Zenyatta player, been in the pro scene a long time, who was joined by guests Jake, Jane, and as well Elk from the Philadelphia Fusion. I'll leave a link in the description below to the entire podcast. It's 3 hours long, but this segment explains what we're talking about here with sort of the downside to changing this Brigitte shield interaction.
Changes how GOATs is played. It doesn't really make GOATs any less or more viable.
It made it really, really awkward to do anything, because like defensive GOATs is now so much stronger than offensive GOATs, because you can just like bleed fights out for an additional like 30 seconds to a minute for fights that already took, like I think on Hanamura today I had a 2.5 minute fight trying to cap second point, and like that's just already insane. So like as soon as you can't really easily engage onto Ryan or Brig, I think I feel like it makes GOATs kind of stagnant, but so like you still have the shield bash change, right, with the going down to 5 damage from 50 and the healing change, but I don't think that the shield bash, as far as like going through shields or not, is actually an effective change to even make.
The reality is this change is really bad because you're not like, and additionally it's a buff to Brigitte sometimes, right? But now maybe theoretically you can just like hold shield even if you're in a bad situation as Brig and you're you know, the enemy team has more abilities than you can just like hold shield so they can't bash you and headshot you with Zen. But
They go on to explain in this clip as well that now Reinhardt will be able to be the major aggressor in this comp, rather than being the punching bag that both teams are going at and trying to protect. But this doesn't necessarily reduce the effectiveness of 3-3. Goat's comp is now, I think, rightfully described by many as being quite the high skill cap composition, just not in the traditional FPS way. It takes a ton of cool coordination and big combos in order to make it lethal, and all of those plays will still exist. They'll just function a bit differently. And really good Reins that are able to quickly put their shield up in order to punish a Brigitte trying to stun him will overwhelm the enemy, so a lot of control will be put into Reins' hands, whereas before it was largely in his team. But we're not really reducing the effectiveness of the comp, we're just rearranging where it is. Now, I know what many of you probably will be thinking. It doesn't feel too intuitive to talk about a counter to Goats being an essential piece of Goats as well, but until we have something like exclusive pick or hero ban or something, very often it's pretty important for the meta to be able to counter a hero with that hero. I don't think that's the interaction any of us want. I even spoke to Jane about mirror matches not being so fun, but for the way the game's been played for the last few years, that's definitely an essential component. Now, I want to attempt to play a bit of devil's advocate to the mainstream opinion on this, because despite most of the pro community thinking that Goats will still be very strong, I want to field a possible counterexample to the type of theory crafting comps that I want to see some top-level players test out to see if they can hold up at all. So we already know that Goats can get countered if you play enough damage characters. Either you will split their attention or simply put out too much damage. You can imagine that Ashe might fit into that playstyle as well in the 3 DPS, but my real question always comes down to the front line. You see, the problem is, if you barely run enough tanking presence, on the live version of the game, because Brigitte is able to be used offensively, if you don't have enough frontline characters like your own Brig, your own Zarya, everything else that can help the Reinhardt out, he will simply get run over. There is no amount of shield management that he can do in order to maintain and sustain on the front line. But on this new PTR patch, although the pros and the podcast seem to think that this will just still force you to play Goats but more defensively, what I want to find out is if a solo tank can hold their own defensively. Because, although of course, the enemy Goats comp will still have a massive main tank advantage because they can bubble their Rein, punishing you from ever swinging, and do have the stun in order to punish you if you go too aggressive, my question is, will finally there be enough defensive options for a 3 DPS team to run a solo tank who can play like they did back in the day when Soon had his heyday in Team Rogue, where they'd run a solo tank Winston to basically just touch the objective every now and again and sustain against some of these multi-tank comps. We already know that Winston now can shield dance in order to dodge stun. Brig herself does less damage, which is important, but also, what about a solo tank Reinhardt, who essentially can do the same thing as long as you play defensively well enough to block Brigitte going aggro onto you? What's to say that you can't sustain long enough to stall up the objective a bit in order to draw that process out long enough for your DPS to do damage? It's one of my favorite phrases to say on the channel, but I think it's the best way to explain it is that it's not hard to counter Goats comp, it's just hard to counter it before they win the game, aka playing the objective. It's hard to run a different comp that can somehow sustain on the objective to have a chance for you not to lose it before you deal enough damage to kill them from range. Sure, these quad DPS strategies on a big map with long lines of sight like Root are nice, but what about all the rest of the maps in the game, right? Can we toss Reinhardt into a situation where, on the live version of the game, he would just get shield bashed and run over, frankly. There's nothing he can do about it, whereas now, he can do a lot more by himself, meaning that you can afford to have more DPS options on your team. And as long as your frontline can sustain and run away and play keep away, you eventually will have more damage than them, theoretically, if your DPS can hit anything. So, despite my concerns that more changes are needed, it may also be the case that an entire new playstyle around defensive Reinhardt solo tank play, or perhaps Winston as well, though that's probably a bit harder, may emerge in order to see a 3 DPS comp start to prevail. The only problem is, recently Zarya's gotten buffed, and of course D.Va has been incredible forever. The GOATS comp doesn't lack medium range damage options, and it would take a team to severely mechanically outplay their opposition a lot of the time for a solo tank triple DPS to work. And we already know what this looks like. I'm showing footage on screen from contenders of teams attempting to run quad DPS, single heal, single tank to have overbearing amounts of damage to take out the GOATS comp. But the issue with this is that, yes, you can choose enough damage sources to force the enemy to stop playing 3-3. The problem is, it requires you to play a comp that is so bad that with a couple swaps of their own, they easily can swap to counter you. Which you might say, well, yeah, that's how Overwatch is supposed to be played, but normally, when you outplay your opposition and they swap, you typically don't have to immediately swap off the ult charge advantage you just gained. If a comp is required to play too heavy of a rock, paper, scissors playstyle, where the enemy swaps something up and then you instantly lose, it's really hard to take it competitively seriously other than to cheese out a surprise team fight or two, which is why 3-3 is so stable, because you keep most of those ultimates, you don't have to change out most of its components, you can toss in a Winston instead of the Rhine if you want more reach, and even though it can somewhat be countered, you're not in as much of a disadvantage when it's time to swap things up. And sometimes you don't even have to swap at all, because you're eventually getting some of the best ultimates in the game, and that's core to what makes 3-3 so good. It was also discussed on the podcast, possibly a game-wide ultimate nerf. They did this quite a long time ago, where the ult charge rate took longer for everyone to get their ultimates across the board. This was incredibly impactful, and actually one of the reasons why originally Mercy went from being a meta pick, because she could team wipe res all the crazy ult stacks that kept coming through, to being kind of irrelevant. I kind of debate this point. A lot of people say that people just learned how to play Ana, and that's why Ana started to look so good. I maintain that it was that ult charge change that really swung the difference between needing a defensive ult that brought you back from all the crazy ults to swinging a bit to be more mid-fight focused, where Ana was a lot stronger. This kind of change would be a productive way, I think, to stop 3-3 from being so dominant, because ultimates on a lot of the other characters in the game, namely DPS, don't do a whole lot, considering tank characters like D.Va can eat an entire barrage or soldier sites, etc., and instead get enough offensive power out of their ultimates by the high-level coordination to get D.Va bombs into gravitons, or setting up shatters. Yes, bashing from the front no longer will be viable, but Briggs will definitely look for flanks in order to get behind the Reinhardt to do the same thing. We broke down on this channel how Kib was able to hide in order to set up for these bashes. If he's able to do that, he probably can flank as well and get behind the enemy Reinhardt. It's really the offense of 3-3 with their ultimates being so much better than other ultimates in the game that helps maintain it to be kind of patch-proof to some degree, unless Blizzard takes a major jump in a different direction, like hero bans or changing how ultimates charge. Obviously, they mentioned this on the podcast too, a lot of casual players probably wouldn't go for that, as if you are a really low-ranked player, you may never get an ultimate like Graviton Surge in an entire round, which is kind of a feels bad, but to some degree, in order to save us from an Overwatch League Season 2 GOATS apocalypse, I would like to see some more drastic changes made in order to solve this from being a major problem, because despite how excited I am about potential 3 DPS comps coming back in order to push GOATS to its limit, I'm not too convinced in its viability. Unless we also saw, let's say, Tracer get her Pulse Bomb nerf reverted. I don't know why the heck we needed Pulse Bomb to not be able to kill a target that has full rally armor on it. For some reason, sustain in the game went massively up, and we also nerfed Tracer's damage output with her ultimate, at the same time of introducing the one character who could instantly delete her. Now, granted, Tracer will be a bit more viable now that she can't be one-shot killed by Brigitta anymore, so maybe that's enough, but I still think that rally armor is a serious problem for Tracer and her Pulse Bomb. So, I threw a lot of information at you in today's video. You'll have to let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Are you concerned that GOATS is actually better in a different way? and the counters aren't really there, are you optimistic for a potential solo tank playstyle that will give your team the firepower to shred goats at range while still having a chance to sustain on the front line? Will Tracer even be attempted to be played? But who knows, really. This is a really strange patch that's coming up Tuesday, and I'm really excited to finally be able to get into it. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out, lets us know that you're enjoying the content, and if you haven't already, please subscribe because we upload each and every day, so you're going to want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and take memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.